well-being. What is good for human well-being? St. Thomas Aquinas, that's the greatest systematic theologian of the Roman Catholic Church, accepted both strains. Since his teaching is the seminal influence on the traditional Catholic use of natural law, subsequent Catholic theology has been influenced by both interpretations as well. Okay, Thomas Aquinas' concept about natural law was this two-pronged concept, John, and the idea is that humans participate in eternal law by reason. There's that dominant reason again, and that we find out what natural law is by discovering what being human really means. You see, notice it doesn't refer us to the Lord, it refers us to what does it mean to be really human. You know, your idea of that might be something completely different.
Yours or from somebody else.
But reason is to be used in determining what being really human means. And therefore,
I wish I had the quote. I think it's from either 6 testimonies or 9 testimonies, where Ellen White says that the very same things that brought about the French Revolution will happen once again just before Christ comes.
That's right. That's right. In the Thomistic perspective, that's Thomas Aquinas, doing good is following reason's lead to actualize human potential. There's your modern psychology concept. Evil is whatever frustrates or prohibits that full realization. So the individual has to actualize their full potential. This fundamental norm does not give content for action, but it does indicate a basic disposition we ought to have, according to Thomas. It encourages us to become who we are by acting in a way that would actualize our potential. That idea comes through over and over again. Aquinas then moves on to the specific norms of natural law based on the natural inclinations. Now, would you like law based on natural inclinations of the human heart?
Terrifying.
That's what Nazism had. The origin of our specific moral obligations lies in these natural inclinations which give content to the fundamental requirement to do good and avoid evil. The practical reason perceives the natural inclinations in human beings in the form of moral imperatives. So the natural inclinations in people become moral imperatives which become the concrete conclusions of natural law. So on the one hand, just to summarize it and encapsulate it, on the one hand, John, we have the order of nature concept with these environmental type of thing of fitting into the environment, fitting into nature, conforming to nature. On the other hand, we have the order of reason concept of natural law, which uses reason to evaluate what being truly human really means, and the good is what actually promotes the full potential of the human being. Now, what if someone else stands in the way of your full potential?
Then you exterminate them.
That is exactly what, when you look at Nazism, John, what did Hitler say? And that's National Socialism. He said, the Aryan peoples have to actualize their full potential. That's in other words.
Right.
We have to become the master race. We have to achieve our full potential and let nothing stand in our way. Okay, there's your order of reason. On the other hand, in order to accomplish that, the order of nature, natural law, had to be obeyed by biological purity, racial purity. You see, the subhuman races that stand in the way, that are inferior, have to go so they don't adulterate the blood of this master race, and so we can bear children who are in the image of the Lord. That's right out of Mein Kampf. So you see, the two strains that Thomas Aquinas accepted in Roman Catholic law are really the basis of National Socialism in Germany. That whole movement, and that even beyond the Argentine government releasing papers showing the connection between the Vatican and Nazism, and what we know about the concordat between the Pope and Hitler and Mussolini and Franco, and the escape routes at the end over the Alps. Natural law is the basic philosophical premise of National Socialism. Now, when the Jesuits say they want to take a nation like America that was once steeped in the absolutes of Protestant morality, shifting it through relativism and then bringing it into natural law, that is astounding. when you look at history. Look at the developments that have happened in the 20th century based on natural law, and these natural inclinations becoming moral imperatives. You can see that in the philosophy and the thinking and the ideology of National Socialism, of Nazism. They wanted to go back to their primitive roots, their primitive drives, the primitive Teutonic drives, you see. And nothing was to stand in the way of that. So natural law, when you understand those two dimensions, now in more recent times, natural law in Catholicism has tended to emphasize the order of reason aspect of it. And psychology has tended to emphasize the order of reason, exploring human experience to see what will develop the human potential to the ultimate. And so we have different emphasis and different shifts at different periods in Roman Catholic history, but really we see the two of them be emerging again in psychology as well as in the environmental concerns, forming a basis, a platform by which all peoples, whether regenerate or unregenerate, can find a common bond, a common linkage for interdependence, globalism, collectivism, everybody coming together in unity.
What could be more important than saving the world, saving our planet? If there's anything that will unite the world, it's this cry of saving the planet, and the environmentalists are becoming a common denominator among all factions of people around the world. We've all got to come together to save our world. Sounds very righteous.
Sure. It always comes as an angel of light.
Absolutely.
Now here's a couple more points now. This is page 243. A moral position based on natural law, then, would be an expression of what the moral community discovers in its experience to be most contributing to the full actualization of human potential to attain human wholeness. Now, do you think that the moral community on earth, the church, will discover in its experience something that will most contribute to the full actualization of human potential to attain human wholeness?
Let me guess. Sunday sacredness, Sunday worship.
Of course. What could contribute more to the full wholeness of humanity and the actualization of human potential? And besides Mary, the apparition of Mary over at Medjugorje has been calling for the world to keep Sunday.
This is breaking the heart of Jesus.
That's right.
That his church is not keeping the Lord's Day. Oh.
Now, John, I want to briefly turn to John Courtney Murray, the Jesuit, who wrote this book, We Hold These Truths, and look at page 301, how he describes natural law. This is the Jesuit concept of natural law now. Quote, to inquire what natural law is means to inquire on the one hand what the human mind is and what it can know, and on the other hand what human society is and to what ends it should work. But, as is obvious, all this is to inquire what man himself is, what this human nature is of which one predicates a law natural. In Catholic natural law, one opts for, quote, a metaphysic of right. I say right advisedly, not rights. So notice, in natural law, in Catholic natural law, the issue is right rather than subjective rights. The natural law does not, in the first instance, furnish a philosophy of human rights in the sense of subjective immunities and powers to demand. In other words, the natural law, and he makes a sharp distinction between Roman Catholic natural law and the law of nature, which our founding fathers were involved in, the Protestant concepts of the law of nature. He says they're 180 degrees apart. The Roman Catholic natural law does not furnish a philosophy of human rights in the sense of subjective immunities, like the Bill of Rights, you see, and powers to demand. This philosophy is consequent on the initial furnishing of a philosophy of right, justice, law, juridical order, and social order. So first, Murray says, you've got to have a philosophy of right, of justice, of law, juridical order, legal order, and social order. Now, I want to look at A few more concepts here. The reason is that natural law thinking does not set out, as Locke did, from the abstract, isolated individual. In other words, natural law thinking does not start out from the abstract, isolated individual. In reality, the concept of the priesthood of all believers, as we've demonstrated in other freedoms rings, and ask what his inalienable rights are as an individual. So natural law does not ask about inalienable rights. Rather, it regards the community as a given equally with the person. Man is regarded as a member of an order instituted by God. And as we think back, the long term over Roman Catholicism, there's the order, divine right of kings, you know, the feudal order of things, and you just fit as a cog into that order, and subject to the laws that make the order an order. Laws that derive from the nature of man, which is as essentially social as it is individual. In the natural law climate of opinion, very different from that set by the Protestant law of nature, objective law has the primacy over subjective rights. Now, in the Smith II case, where Scalia, who was trained in the Jesuit University, Georgetown, formulated that idea, that opinion that was then, basically ushered into the field of law as a result of the decision of the Supreme Court justices, that if there is a valid law, a neutral law of general applicability, if you have a conscientious conviction that runs afoul of that law, you have no choice. You have to obey.
Submit.
So objective law has the primacy over subjective rights. Law is not simply the protection of rights, but their source, because it is the foundation of duties.
That's the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism.
So natural law takes our Constitution and turns it upside down.
Upside down.
And it destroys. And Ellen White says that every Republican and Protestant principle of our Constitution will be repudiated. So, going through this just briefly, the Jesuit definition of the meaning of natural law is that it is an issue of right, which would be defined as the church, according to natural law, rather than rights. And there goes the Bill of Rights, to be replaced by right as defined by the church. The community is a given equal to the individual. There's that community concept. And this again leads to the suppression of individual rights in the name of the community, as in communism. Number 3, man is viewed as a member of the order, subject to the laws that make the order an order, derived from the nature of man exhibited in society. So you just fit into the order, the structure, the hierarchy of the nation. Number 4, objective law has primacy over subjective rights, as in the Smith II case. 5, law is the source of rights, therefore rights are subject to the whim of law.
So what Roman Catholic natural law does is take the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights and turn it upside down and totally negates everything that this country was founded upon.
Did you notice how Joseph Biden was nervous about this concept of natural law?
Joseph Biden gives me the creeps.
But he was still nervous about Clarence Thomas' ideas about natural law. And he said, in the first day of the hearings, he said, the real issue that we're looking at with this nominee to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, is the issue of natural law. And what does he mean by it? And he wouldn't really tell. Human rights, and the 6th point is human rights in the sense of subjective immunities and powers to demand is consequent on the initial furnishing of a philosophy of right, justice, law, juridical order, and social order. So in the concept of the Jesuit concept of natural law, first you erect this concept of what is right, what is just, and what the law is, and then you have your rights after that. And that's exactly the way it was in Russia.
Isn't that what's going on in our church, Bob? That the denomination decides what is right, and then you must subject your conscience to their conscience, and if your conscience is contrary to their conscience, then you must subject yourself to their conscience and acquiesce to their conscience.
Right.
Isn't that what is coming right down from the hierarchical system?
It's even been explicitly stated that way to an individual. Now, Malachi Martin tells us that John Paul has taken a position on this, that no one has the right, democratic or otherwise, to a moral wrong. And no religion based on divine revelation has a moral right to teach such a moral wrong or abide by it. So the question is, who decides what is a moral wrong? And once it is decided that something is a moral wrong, such as perhaps teaching the 4th commandment about the 7th-day Sabbath, then that body of people have no right to teach that position. You see.
Bob, I cannot help but think of something that you said to me yesterday. You said what we are coming down to is a decision whether we are going to be Roman Catholic Seventh-day Adventist or Protestant Seventh-day Adventist. And I believe our people need to know that.
And you see, if we do not exercise Protestantism as a people, and we get used to the conditioning process of fitting into a community decision regarding right based on another norm than the Word of God, and imposing that, such as natural law does, we are subjecting ourselves to a conditioning process to ultimately receive the mark of the beast.
This is Catholicism versus Protestantism, and what we have to ask is, are we going to be Roman Catholic Seventh-day Adventist or Protestant Seventh-day Adventist? That's the basic premise here, folks.
And even the basic notion of submission to an order imposed by church and society, rather than asking first, what is the order of the Word, like Jesus did and John the Baptist did, conditions the people to ultimately deal with the independent ministries, you see, and biblical Adventism, not because its doctrines are erroneous, but because it has violated the order imposed by an ecumenically conscious structure.
Would you mind saying that one more time, slowly, with emphasis?
I'll just read it right here out of Freedom's Ring. The notion of submission to the order imposed by church and society has become very strongly entrenched in the rank and file of Adventism. Amen. Most of Adventism now functions upon the philosophical premises of Catholic natural law. They are prepared to deal with the independent ministries and historic biblical Adventism, not because its doctrines are erroneous, but because it has violated the order imposed by an ecumenically conscious structure.
That's it.
In its quest for truth, biblical Adventism operates upon the biblical Protestant philosophical base, which is completely alien to Catholic natural law.
Amen. That sums it all up, Bob.
And that's why we have to have the security, John, of a heart, life, and our very thinking anchored to the living God through
Amen.
absolute surrender to the Word by faith, so we can get an abundant triumph over the Pope's New World Order.
Amen.
As Luther declared in Daubigny's History of the Reformation here, Book 6, Chapter 9, my strength and my consolation are in a place where neither men nor devils can reach them.
Amen. That's the way we've got to be, Bob. We've got to be so rooted and grounded in why we believe what we believe that we cannot be swayed from being Protestant Seventh-day Adventists and slowly being led into being Roman Catholic Seventh-day Adventists. And that's where the majority of our denomination are headed today. They're becoming Roman Catholic Seventh-day Adventists, and it's frightening. It's happening so quickly, Bob. Can't believe what is happening among our people.
Now I'd like to talk about family feuds in the Roman Catholic Church, John.
All right.
At the very time when Thomas Aquinas was writing these things about the two strains of natural law, the order of nature and the order of reason, the Knights Templar, which we just mentioned a little bit ago, were becoming very, very powerful. They went on the Crusades. They went over to the lands of the East. They made contact with the occult over there, which came into their order. They developed vast land holdings in France and other countries. They had the major central bank that they operated in France. And Philip of France got so fearful that he suppressed the order. He arrested all of them, as we mentioned earlier, except for 13 on a Friday the 13th. He demanded of the Pope that the order be repressed. The Pope was very reluctant, but finally he went along with the suppression of the order, and he issued orders for the suppression of the Knights Templar. Now, in England, in this book, Born in Blood, by John J. Robinson, in England, these Knights Templar went underground. They established lodges where they had a safe place. They established secret signs so that they would know and recognize each other as fellow Masons. And they began fomenting revolution. They wanted to get back in this family feud with the Pope. They wanted to get back at the church as well as the state, the two entities that were persecuting them, because they wanted to establish, as Knights Templar, they had wanted to establish a one World Order. And so they began fomenting trouble. The Peasants' Revolt in England, where almost 100,000 men marched on London, was one evidence of their work. Shortly after their suppression, a few decades after their suppression, they came swarming through. There was nothing that could stop these men. They had conspired, they had laid all their plans, they had men who had let down the drawbridges across the river, the canals, they had men in strategic places. They came and they burned down the buildings of the Knights of Malta, the Hospitaliers, the Knights of Malta, because the Knights of Malta had been given all their holdings in France, you see. And so it was a family feud. And they developed the Masons, and the Masons stayed underground for centuries. In this book here, New World Order by William Still, there's an enormous amount of information here. New World Order, the Ancient Plan of Secret Societies. William Still is a former newspaper editor and a publisher. He has written for USA Today, the Saturday Evening Post, Los Angeles Times Syndicate, Omni Magazine, and produced the syndicated radio program Health News. His father developed the communications, the Defense Communications Network for the military. And during the height of the Nixon struggle, the struggle between Nixon and the Supreme Court over the Watergate tapes, a high-ranking military man came to William's father and said, "Do you think the time is right for a coup in America?" And his father couldn't believe it.
And this is during the Nixon administration?
Yes, and he tells right about in the first few pages here. And William Still's father retained his cool, his equanimity, and he encouraged the man to tell him more. And he was astounded to find that there was being circulated a plot, a plan to subvert the authority of the Supreme Court by Nixon ensconcing himself in power. This led William Still to do 10 years of research. What was behind it? As you remember, John, there was a tremendous struggle between the left wing and the right wing in Nixon's era. And William Still came to the conclusion that left was being pitted against right for a takeover by the Masons in the middle. The Masons, remember, the Knights Templar is the highest degree in the York Rite. The top three, recapping from Jesuit Agenda 2, the top 3 degrees of the York Rite, which is designed for the Christian branch, quote-unquote, of the Masons, is the Knights of the Red Cross, the Knights of Malta, who William Casey, the CIA director, was one. We discussed that last time. And the Knights Templar. So here you had a situation, William Still discovered in his research, where Nixon was planning to ensconce himself in power if necessary and not give up those tapes, and to use the Marines who were around Washington to protect himself and to ensconce himself in power. Meanwhile, there were generals, high-ranking generals, who knew what Nixon was up to and who were determined that if Nixon did that, they would bring in the 82nd Airborne from North Carolina and attack the Marines. We were on the point of civil war, and we didn't know it as a people.
Unbelievable.
And this is the son of the man who developed the communications network for the military. Anyway, he traces the whole history of the Masons, and I just want to hit some significant points in here.
You know, Bob, we're going to find out stuff during the millennium that is just going to curl our hair. That we have no idea how God has been holding back the winds of strife. Hold, he tells those angels.
That's right. He goes into the connection between Karl Marx and the Masons and the Internationale. So you see, in the Russian Revolution, we have a new book here by Richard Pipes for you to read, John.
I'll do that tonight.
It is almost 1,000 pages long. Richard Pipes is the authority on the Russian Revolution. And in this book, he tells of how the Russian Revolution was not a class struggle, but it was... Let me just read it off the back here. Richard Pipes argues convincingly that the Russian Revolution was an intellectual rather than a class uprising, that it was steeped in terror from its very outset, and that it was not a revolution at all, but a coup d'etat, the capture of governmental power by a small minority. Now, we know that Marxism was established in Russia as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. He has a chapter in here on the intelligentsia and discusses the concepts of communist thinking. The intelligentsia worked for decades. From about 1860 on, they were fomenting in the universities. The majority of the students in the universities were the sons of priests, and they were fomenting. They wanted to bring down the Tsar, you see. And you remember in 1917, the Fatima Vision took place. A year and 2 months later, the Tsar was murdered. The Bolshevik Revolution was in full swing. Here, let me tell you what Trotsky said about the human being whom the new regime would create. You see, the idea behind the Russian Revolution was to create a completely new human being. It was to be an experiment that would be extended all over the world. It would create a new human being, not only in Russia, but all over the world. That's why we have such terms as the Internationale. It was an international thing, and Freemasonry supported it at every place. Now, here's what Trotsky wrote. Here's the human being that the new regime would create. Quote, "Man will at last begin to harmonize himself in earnest." Notice, harmonize. Notice the terms now. Remember what we studied about natural law. He will want to master first the semi-conscious and then also the unconscious processes of his own organism. Breathing, the circulation of blood, digestion, reproduction, and within the necessary limits will subordinate them to the control of reason and will. Remember the order of reason, the order of nature, the structures of man, the animal structures. All of this is going to be all harmonized in this revolution. Notice that. Even purely physiological life will become collectively experimental. Notice the collective aspect and the experimental aspect. The human species, the sluggish Homo sapiens, will once again enter the state of radical reconstruction and will become in its own hands the object of the most complex methods of artificial selection and psychophysical training. Man will make it his goal to master his own emotions, to elevate his instincts to the heights of consciousness, to make them transparent, to create a higher socio-biological type, a Superman, if you will. Notice the correlation with the super race concept of Nazism.
Pages?
This is page 137. Man will become incomparably stronger, wiser, subtler. His body will become more harmonious. Now this is Trotsky, who engineered the Bolshevik Revolution. His body will become more harmonious, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more melodious. The forms of life will acquire a dynamic theatricality. The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, Goethe, Marx, and beyond this ridge, other peaks will emerge. So it was to create, what they wanted to do with the Russian Revolution was to create a new man,
Antichrist.
and it would be based on these concepts of natural law, which we discussed. You can see them inherent here. And it would be a social engineering project to create a new man, because it was believed by the communists that if you change the environment, you change the person. Now, have you ever heard anything about that in America?
Absolutely.
That has been fundamental to behavioral science, that the criminal is not a criminal because of some hereditary or cultivated problem that he has, a violation with the law of God, but it's because his environment hasn't been right. And if you change the environment and make it a utopian, and the communists, you know, we're all going to live together, equal wealth. Wealth won't be something that separates anybody. We'll create this Superman. We'll marshal all of the environment to create a superhuman being.
I'm going to be accused of being a racist in saying this, but this was the rationale given in the recent Los Angeles riots. Is taking all of the blame off the people and putting it on the environment, and we are responsible for this. It's our fault, and because the environment, if we will just help the environment and pour money, if we just pour money into it, that'll fix it. Just pour more money into it.
We had a book to read. Let me tell you this, John. I had a Marxist professor at the seminary. Believe it or not. I sat in his class day after day, and there are a number of other students. And they were giving him static all along the way. He was attacking Protestant concepts, Seventh-day Adventist concepts, all of this, and elevating the socialism.
Yes.
And we had to read a book for the class that said, it was written by a radical from the late 60s, one of the student protest leaders of that era who had now become a professor. And he said if we gave each of the people in the ghetto $1,000, then that would really solve the problem.
Unbelievable.
And the title of the book was Blaming the Victim. Well, I was so disturbed about it that one night I got up about 3 o'clock in the morning and I got out my Baker's Dictionary of Christian Ethics and I looked up Marxism, and it fit exactly what we have been taught in class.
Marxism, absolutely.
Notice this, 136. The underlying premise is the idea of Helvetius that by establishing an environment which makes social behavior a natural instinct, socialism will enable man to realize his potential to the fullest. Notice socialism and full human potential and Roman Catholic law, order of reason.
This is how Marx and Lenin both established socialism, was by telling the people that they would alleviate all of these problems if they would just all share and share alike.
And Marx wrote a book entitled The Holy Family. Have you ever heard that before? Right out of Roman Catholicism?
The Holy Family.
That term, anyway.
The Holy Family.
And he wrote this in 1844, 1845, and here's what he said. The whole development of man depends on education and environment. If man draws all his knowledge, sensations, etc. from the world of the senses and the experience gained in it, the empirical world must be arranged so that in it man experiences and gets used to what is really human. If really human, remember that in natural law? You have to study the mind and the experience of man to see what is really human. If man is shaped by his surroundings must be made human. All right, this is communism. This is the philosophy of communism now. Now, I wanted to take a look here, John, at this book once again. Karl Marx and the Internationale. In this book, William Still tells about how the Soviet Revolution was financed by American bankers.
So wait, what? The Soviet Revolution
was financed by American bankers who were connected with the Masons. And you see, they were not worried about what the communists were doing because they were pulling the strings. Lenin, after he quotes in here what Lenin said after he took control. After Lenin took power, this is page 142 in New World Order. After Lenin took power, he slowly began to understand that he was not really pulling all the strings. Someone else was silently in control of the Soviet nation. Lenin lamented, quote, "The state does not function as we desired." How does it function? The car does not obey. A man is at the wheel and seems to lead it, but the car does not drive in the desired direction. It moves as another force wishes.
So Lenin even recognized that there were satanic forces out
beyond
there. Beyond him and the supernatural he could not control.
This is a heavily documented book.
Now, do you think he was referring to supernatural forces or forces out there such as the Illuminati and the Jesuits?
I don't know that he knew, but I'll tell you.
He just knew there was something out there that he had no control over.
Let me read you something here, John. He, like Hitler, had a high regard for the Jesuits. Page 26 of the book The Jesuits by Malachi Martin. Lenin swore at the end of his life that if he had had 12 men like one of those early Jesuits, his communism would have swept the world. He had a high regard for the Jesuits. He took a man who had been training to be a Catholic priest, Dzerzhinsky, who became a communist in the Catholic seminary and was expelled. He took that man and made him the head of the Cheka, which is the precursor of the KGB, the counterintelligence operation. At any rate, in here, Stalin himself, now, was enrolled in school to become a priest at the theological seminary. And he soon found that the seminary was honeycombed with secret societies.
I didn't know Stalin studied to be a priest, a Catholic priest.
Page 143, who financed Lenin and Trotsky? The evidence points to a variety of European and American financiers. One German responsible for the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution was Max Warburg. the brother of American Paul Warburg, the prime mover in establishing the U.S. Federal Reserve System. We talked about that in Jesuit Agenda 2. Max ran a Rothschild Allied family bank in Frankfurt, Germany, and was the head of the German secret police during World War I. He goes on to tell about how John Schiff, the old man in America, who sank $20 million for the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. This man goes on to document how we not only financed the Russian Revolution, but we gave them the secrets of the atomic bomb.
I've heard that for years, that we gave them the secrets to the atomic bomb.
Look at the evidence in
Why?
here.
Why would we want to give them the secrets to the atomic bomb?
We sent them plutonium. We sent
the
them
United States?
Yes.
Sent Russia plutonium?
Yes.
And gave them the secrets and wanted them to build the atomic bomb?
Yes.
Why? Why would we want them to do that?
Because there was another agency interested in ultimate global domination. They were interested in this experiment in
We've
Russia.
got to realize that we're not dealing with just countries here. We're dealing with a global, sinister force that is orchestrating world governments for a much bigger picture than what we see just from country to country. So we're talking about forces that are controlling the whole world, not just individual countries.
Let me read to you out of 166 here. He's discussing the papers, the report that was sent to Russia. The text of the report, let's see, clipped to this note to Molotov from Harry Hopkins was a large map which bore the legend Oak Ridge, Manhattan Engineering District, and a carbon copy of a report from Oak Ridge with the name Harry Hopkins typed on it, as though it was a copy specifically prepared for Hopkins. The text of the report contained words Major Jordan was unfamiliar with then, but which we all know today. Among them were uranium, cyclotron, proton, and deuteron. Of course, Colonel Katakov, that's the Russian here in America, was furious with Major Jordan when Jordan began finding out about these things, you see. And Jordan assumed he would be fired, but surprisingly, he was allowed to stay on. Although Jordan reported everything that had transpired to the intelligence section of the Air Force, he heard nothing in return. And there was an extra special consignment in April of 1943, notice that's during the war, of what he called experimental chemicals. And dropping down here, after his conversation was terminated with the infamous Harry Hopkins, Jordan asked Colonel Katakov what the name of this important chemical was. Colonel Katakov went to his desk and pulled from a folder marked bomb powder a sheet of paper and showed Major Jordan a word he had first seen the previous month in the black leather suitcase, uranium. Jordan wrote, "This shipment was the one and only cash item to pass through my hands except for private Russian purchases of clothing and liquor. It was the only one out of a tremendous multitude of consignments that I was ordered not to enter on my tally sheets. It was the only one I was forbidden to discuss with my superiors and the only one I was directed to keep secret from everybody." And so he tells in here how it came in 15 wooden cases, and the cases were trucked to the air base at Great Falls, Montana, took off for Fairbanks without a hitch. At Fairbanks, one box fell from the plane, smashing a corner and spilling a small quantity of chocolate brown powder. Out of curiosity, a soldier there picked up a handful of the unfamiliar grains with a notion of asking somebody what they were. A Soviet officer slapped the crystals from his palm and explained nervously, "No, no, burn hands." Totally 3 consignments of uranium chemicals, 1,465 pounds, or nearly 3/4 of a ton, were shipped to the Soviet Union. In addition, 1 kilogram, or 2.2 pounds of uranium metal was shipped at a time when the total American stock was 4.5 pounds. We sent them almost half of our stock.
Bob. Unbelievable.
Major Jordan also, and this is all documented
Truth
material.
is stranger than fiction. I'm convinced of that.
Major Jordan also documented in his meticulous style that even 1,000 grams of precious deuterium oxide or heavy water was sold to the Soviets in November 1943.
And the Jesuits were behind this?
The Masons.
Which was the arm of the Jesuits.
Yes, I want to now pull some things together here.
And the purpose was?
Well, we were financing, we were aiding Russia. Of course, at that time, Russia was our ally in war against Germany.
Right.
But the point of all of this that William Still is making is that the Masons were carrying on their plan for a global order in which there would be this social engineering of creating an environment to create a certain kind of human being, a new world order, to create a new world order. And the Russian Revolution was an experiment to accomplish that. Now, we discussed about family feuds, John. You notice now how we've been talking about how the Templars were feuding with the papacy. And something interesting develops in this book here toward the end. Right after Vatican II. You heard about that, John? In 1967, high officials of both Craft and Scottish Rite Masonry actually sat down at the table with major leaders of the Knights of Columbus to discuss their common goals of morality, patriotism, and law and order. So there was a real coming together right after Vatican II. Not only in all these other dimensions that we've been talking about, but between the ancient Knights Templar, who are the Masons now, and the Knights of Columbus, to discuss common goal 332 in the book Born in Blood. So what does it all mean? Now, what happened to our people? Let me ask you, John. Here we have, and I must grab here Malachi Martin's book, because Malachi ties a lot of this together. Gramsciism. Who is Gramsci? Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist who said that the way Lenin is approaching the communist revolution will never work, because Christianity has in it a seed of resistance against it.
Amen.
We have to destroy and secularize Christianity in order to have the communist revolution spread over the world. And we must use the intelligence community to accomplish this through peaceful means, through boardrooms, through political parties, through parliaments. We must advance the cause of international socialism in this way. Now, what Malachi Martin tells us in page after page here as he discusses Gramsciism in his book Keys of This Blood is that the Roman Catholic Church absorbed this Gramsciism. And Gorbachev is the ultimate example of Gramsciism in action, willing to even sacrifice the Russian territorial integrity, the USSR territorial integrity, for the cause of the principle of what they were about. And notice the close connection between Gorbachev and the Pope, how they work together. And in here, in Keys of This Blood, Malachi Martin says that the Roman Catholic Church took on this Gramsciism and then became the midwife and wet nurse for promoting secularism in America to accomplish this same purpose. Now, what happened to our believers? If the Russian experiment is a prototype of what may be coming to some extent around the world with collectivism, with the outworking of natural law, in a benign form now, penetrating all over, developing a collectivism with the Roman Catholic Church having promoted it, and now the Roman Catholic Church having promoted a secularism to destroy the American Protestantism and bringing in concepts of natural law. What does the future hold? What happened to our believers in Russia? I want to grab a book here.
You mean to our Seventh-day Adventist believers?
Seventh-day Adventist believers.
Well, I know for a fact that from what I've heard from eyewitnesses and people that have come back from Russia since the Iron Curtain has come down, that our true Seventh-day Adventist church in Russia has been underground for years. That what is above ground is the organized church in Russia is a fake. It's a phony. It's a counterfeit.
Yeah.
That's not the Seventh-day Adventist church in Russia.
Well, what happened in Russia is most significant for us. Here is a book entitled True Witness, John, the story of Seventh-day Adventists in the Soviet Union by Marit Sapietz.
Now, is this written by a Seventh-day Adventist?
Non-Seventh-day Adventist. She's from Keston College. And Keston College in England has studied the experience of Christians in the Eastern Bloc nations under communism.
And she chose to write a book on Seventh-day Adventists.
Seventh-day Adventism. The true Seventh-day Adventists were enormously influential in pushing for freedom. Just to mention something here. Well, let me give you a little history first, John. In 1929, that's about a little over a decade after the Bolshevik Revolution. A law was passed on religious associations in Russia. And the upshot of that was that the mainline Adventist church decided to, as she documents in here, she quotes right from their document, decided to go along with the Russian military, sending their young men in, not making any provisos about non-combatancy or anything like that. They would kill and they would violate the Sabbath and all of that. And then there was a group of Seventh-day Adventists that said, no, we cannot break the fourth or sixth commandment. And they became known as the true and faithful Seventh-day Adventists. They were the ones then that stood for conscience through thick and thin, and the leader of them was a man named Vladimir Shelkov. And in his memoirs, Andrei Sakharov tells of how he went to the trial of Shelkov. Shelkov was an enormously spiritually powerful man, and he was an inspiration to Sakharov. Sakharov worked on developing the bomb, the hydrogen bomb in Russia, a great physicist. And he went to the trial of Shelkov. It was a religious trial because of Shelkov's convictions. He was not allowed to come in, but that gives us the idea of the international stature that Shelkov had. Shelkov spent decades in prison camps, in concentration camps, and I have heard it said that the members, the people, inmates in the concentration camps would always know when Friday evening came and when sundown came, because they would hear the screams of those Adventists who would refuse to work and would be put to torture at that time when sundown came Friday evening.
We take the name Seventh-day Adventist for granted. We take this wonderful truth we have as for granted. I tell you, if some of us were going through what the true and faithful have gone through for years, we would know what it really means to be Seventh-day Adventist.
Now, the mainline Seventh-day Adventist church, their, quote, registered church in Russia, began sending their kids to school on Sabbath even, whereas the true and free faithful would not do that, you see. It was a matter of whether the orientation to God will be supreme or the orientation to the state will be supreme. It's
all coming down to.
Now, on page 263 of this book, True Witness, we read about some of the visitors that came to the Soviet Union in the late 70s. What is so significant to us about what the experience in Russia is how did the various Adventist bodies relate to the state and relate to God? Was God viewed as an inalienable relationship that couldn't be sacrificed in any way, shape, or form? Or was religious liberty to be fitted in around the law of the state, like what we discussed with the Jesuit concept of natural law?
I think it's very significant that we find out, because you see, up until this time, as long as the Iron Curtain was up, we had no idea what was really going on in the Soviet Union with our Adventist people. But now that we have some freedom to know, that they have some freedom to get out and to get the information out, I think it's very significant that our Adventist people here in America find out what the true and faithful Adventists in Russia went through, because, Bob, I believe we're about the same thing.
We are already in the same situation. And the church is splitting down the same lines on the same philosophical, theological issues.
How did they deal with it?
Will the Lord God of heaven be our ultimate norm, and will we refuse to bow? Or will we bow and have religious liberty after bowing? You see, here on page 263 of True Witness, the story of Seventh-day Adventists in the Soviet Union, read about what happened in the late 70s and following, when General Conference men began coming into Russia. Dr. Bert Beach, you remember about him?
Oh, yes.
Who visited the USSR in June of 1977, repeated uncritically the statements of Soviet officials concerning the existence of religious liberty. See, the Soviet officials would say, we've got religious liberty in Russia, and in their constitution they provide for religious liberty. But they say if the state security is threatened, then, you know, the individual right has to be suspended in the name of state security. That same thing has happened, of course, in America, where the rights of Japanese Americans on the eve of World War II,
absolutely,
they were put in concentration camps under the preamble of the Constitution that it's for the common good, for the protection of the common good.
Right.
Anyway, Beach repeated uncritically the statements of Soviet officials concerning the existence of religious liberty, sometimes reproducing even the original phraseology. Although he himself admitted that religious freedom in the USSR was limited to worship in registered churches and excluded almost any other form of religious activity, Dr. Beach also asserted that, quote, believers have many opportunities for the practice of their religion as long as such practice does not violate Soviet law, end quote. He then gave a list of such violations, which included, quote, playing on superstition, illegal printing enterprises. You see, the underground true and free Adventists got a hold of a printing press, and the KGB could not locate it, and they printed material and sent it all over.
Bless their hearts. Amen.
Slandering the Soviet system. See, the true and free were accused of that because they went to the Helsinki watch groups and the meetings in Madrid, the meetings monitoring religious liberty in Russia, and they sent in reports of how they were being dragged before courts, how they were having their children taken away from them, how they were being persecuted by the KGB for standing for their convictions.
And that's exactly what the independent ministries are to do with our Adventist people. They are the only ones that are letting our Adventist people know what is really going on, what the denominational structure is really doing against the true and faithful. And if it wasn't for the Adventists, if it wasn't for the independent ministries that God has raised up to let our Adventist people know what is really going on, they would be totally in the dark, thinking that the structure was just doing wonderful things and having no idea of the sinister underbelly of our denominational structure.
Yes. So, see, the registered church and the General Conference attacked the true and free faithful for slandering the Soviet system because they told about what was really going on and the persecution they were enduring for having illegal printing enterprises and, quote, refusing to abide by the rules of Soviet society. So, see, you can see from that that the mainline church or the registered church took the position that we have to first fit in with the rules of Soviet society. If the Soviet society says our children must go to school on Sabbath, we send our kids to school on Sabbath, and then we have religious liberty after that.
That's right.
Whereas the true and free Adventists said, we will have the inalienable rights given us by God, and we will practice our religious liberty according to the Gospel Commission, regardless of Soviet law.
And what does the organization and what does the structure say? That if these dissidents do not go along, they are the ones who are causing us problems with fitting into the norm here, and they must be exterminated.
Beach, did not explain that such charges could be used against any kind of religious activities, and gave no examples of persons who had committed the crimes, but merely stated that, quote, a serious religious liberty dilemma could arise if there were a conflict of conscience between the requirements of belief and the dictates of law, end quote. Dr. Beach gave no indication that this dilemma already existed, not only among Adventists, but in all the churches of the Soviet Union. He went on to make a wholly artificial distinction between Russian and American concepts of liberty,